Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Paymar, and you are listening to The Big Shift, the podcast that looks at the seismic changes our world and our country confront. Today, we're looking into a subject of ultimate importance. In fact, nothing could be more important than our freedom. In the past year or so, we've seen the Supreme Court of the United States eliminate a woman's right to choose whether she bears a child. Affirmative action has been reversed. Students are forced to pay back intolerable levels of debt. The LGBTQ community is under attack over free speech issues. There is book banning, vicious anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant attack. What comes next? My next guest is Eric Kay, and he, unfortunately, has seen this play before. He is a Holocaust survivor. Eric was born in Heidelberg, Germany in 1926. He is now a very young guy, 97 years old. Eric, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us today on the podcast.
That's fine. I'm happy to be here.
Well, just a little background about you, Eric, so the audience knows. You were one of the very few lucky ones in Europe who survived the extermination camps that the Nazis established, which killed 6 million Jews, mostly in gas chambers. You were saved through a program called Kindertransport. 10,000 Jewish children were evacuated to England before World War II began. You and I have talked several times on the phone, and you've told me that you had a very normal and happy life until you were about 6 years old. And I know it's a long time ago to remember all of this, but then the Nazis came to power and everything changed. What was life like for you and your family in Germany before Hitler took power?
I would say it was pretty normal like the rest of the population because Jews prior to Hitler were pretty well integrated into German society and were very loyal toward being German. And Jewish, of course, was their religion, but there wasn't any severe discrimination, which is not to say that there weren't some anti-Semitic situations long before Hitler came to power. That, of course, increased because he and his party, the Nazi party, that was sort of one of their main missions. And it sort of grew, but it certainly changed by an order of magnitude when he got into power in 1933.
Yeah, and you said in April of 1933 that when he came to power, that your life changed dramatically, almost overnight. You were 6 years old. You suddenly became very confused by what was going on all around you. You were constantly frightened. Your parents were becoming afraid, and there was a lot of tension and apprehension. Do you recall much of that?
Yes, I recall that in a way as if it happened yesterday, but I certainly can remember in detail of how it pretty well changed overnight.
What was going on? You're 6 years old, and all of a sudden you're sensing that something is not right, that something has changed, that there is a big difference. You're feeling that in your household.
Well, I'm feeling it primarily because I have to stay in my household. I can't go out on the streets anymore and play with other little kids, which I did before. At that point, perhaps the most confusing or frightening part is as a 6-year-old, I couldn't understand why all of this is happening. That's, of course, changed very quickly over a period of very few years after 1933. But the first reaction was just fear, and I just had to be totally confined to my home. And confusion was really how it all started for me at that particular point.
You also mentioned that when you did go out on the occasional visit out of the house, it became acceptable for non-Jewish children to harass and beat you up in public with absolutely no one reprimanding them. I mean, it sounds like it was a horrible experience.
Well, that, of course, was very true. There are specific incidents that I remember along those lines, like going on my bicycle and being beaten up by kids. And actually, I broke my glasses and they damaged my bike. And there was people around, adults and other young people, and they kind of cheered them on. There was no reprimanding them, which again, most of all, I couldn't understand. What have I done to deserve this, and why isn't somebody stopping it?
Well, then there were the SA, the Nazi troops, the men in brown uniforms who stood in front of your father's business, threatening anyone who wanted to come into his business and referring to your father as the damn Jew. Do you recall that?
I certainly recall, and of course, again, the main reaction was fear and lack of understanding. But that certainly is exactly what happened. And by the way, not just at my dad's business, but at all the Jewish businesses in the town of Heidelberg. That's how it really kind of public demonstration of all this started, with that particular event, that they boycotted, if that's all the Jewish businesses, and basically try to scare anybody who goes in away from going in.
And that would make it almost impossible to make a living, right?
Yes, that's true. But I have to remind you, I mean, all of these things became clear to me as I grew older. And obviously, at this point, I can, in hindsight, explain things. But I just want to re-emphasize, as a young kid, at that particular moment, it was mainly confusion and fear.
Do you recall any conversations in the house or among your friends about what was going on?
Yes.
Why were the Germans, for no apparent reason? I mean, anti-Semitism has a long history in Europe, but for no apparent reason, they turned against you because, for one reason, you were a Jew.
That is absolutely correct. But I want to sort of emphasize that that is the manifestation of a lot of things that the Germans were feeling at that time. They were very, very unhappy. I mean, in the late 20s, as we well know from the same thing happening here in the US, there was this incredible depression worldwide, huge amount of unemployment in Germany. And then, of course, there was also already a fear of communism, which was sort of being propagated on the eastern part of Europe. The Germans at that time probably, at least to the same degree as Americans during the Depression, felt very unhappy with their lives, what's happening. And then Hitler and his party, they were already very loud at the very beginning because they had propagandized their anti-Semitic goals long before Hitler was elected. I think I mentioned in fact, he used the term that he's going to rub out Jewry in Europe. And that, by the way, is also contained in what he calls his Bible, the Mein Kampf.
My Struggle.
Which is a book that later on every German had to read and be versed with it. And in it, I mean, he makes very clear what his intention is. And it was primarily that he wanted to create what he called ein Herrenvolk, which is a super race. And he chose the Aryan. His definition of the super race were those that qualified for the definition of an Aryan, and any non-Aryan and he declared that very, very soon, openly, after he was elected in 1933. He declared all Jews and a number of other people, all handicapped people, and certainly black people. And
The
the
Roma.
word he used, he called them all Untermenschen, which means subhuman. And
Yeah.
that was, I mean, there were no bones made about it. But of
Hmm.
course, the German people, probably like any other people at that time, or say in the US now, they couldn't imagine what that really meant, or they
Hmm.
certainly couldn't imagine that it would in fact happen. And that's what happened in a very short time. And that's the part that I think people nowadays need to be aware of.
Well, you also had the situation where the Germans had to surrender after World War I, and that was an extraordinary humiliation for the Germans.
Absolutely. They thought it was very unfair.
And the reparations that they had to
Yeah,
pay.
well, that was one of the main reasons.
And money became worthless. I mean, it took a wheelbarrow full of money to go buy groceries.
That is exactly right. That's the Depression.
At the same time that all of this is going on, you've got the Bolsheviks, and
Correct.
they're considered to be headed by the Jewish people. And there were Jews among the Bolsheviks. At the same time, you had a very wealthy class of people in Germany running businesses and some banks. So you had this hatred coming from both ends of the spectrum.
Absolutely. I just want to make the point, and that gets to this idea of what happens to people when they're very unhappy. They need to find somebody who is causing all this. The term is a scapegoat. That wasn't invented by the Germans. I mean, scapegoat has been used as a tactic to sort of blame somebody for problems for hundreds of years historically. That
Sure.
wasn't invented by the Germans, but of course, why would you expect somebody who wants to find a scapegoat for his own good, Hitler in this case?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he couldn't pick somebody, in his opinion, that fits the bill better for the
No.
reasons you've just stated.
Plus, if you look back in history, many Germans were Lutheran, and Martin Luther, he had a decree that Jews needed to convert to Christianity. And
Absolutely correct. But let me add to that, which is sort of a really sad thing, that of course, not all Jews were, very religious or anything of this sort, just like today in any denomination. Some people declare themselves whatever as Christians, but don't necessarily worry about that or go to church all that much. And then,
right.
of course, there are others. Same was true for Jews. There were a very significant number of Jews who tried to escape this anti-Semitic horror by trying to convert to Christianity primarily. And usually the most, and especially in the part of Germany where I lived, the Catholic Church was the most obvious Christian denomination.
Mm-hmm.
So they can try to convert to Christianity, and some of them succeeded in doing that. The Catholic Church accepted them, but then later on, in the following years during the Hitler era, the Catholic Church turned all of these people over to Jews because they were now being threatened if they
Mm-hmm.
didn't come through. And so a lot of these people, and this is before the war started, a lot of these people then were really sort of living in a vacuum because, of course, the Jewish population was hesitant to accept them back because they felt they were betraying their heritage by wanting to become Christian. And the Christian church was turning him back to Hitler. And by the way, almost all of those, we're talking about thousands, and all of those ended up in the extermination camps like every other person of Jewish heritage.
Weren't the Nuremberg laws passed that basically said that if you were born from a Jewish woman, you were Jewish, no
Not
matter?
only that, you had to have two grandparents two sets of grandparents who are of Jewish heritage, that makes you Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's what your papers, and in Germany, they're very good at keeping records of
Mm-hmm.
everything, including every particular person that was murdered in the concentration camps. There are very good records of that the Germans, they were able to trace all of this kind of stuff. And so a lot of people ended up being Jewish. Some of them, I bet, didn't even know that their grandparents were of Jewish heritage.
The persecution that began really in the 20s and early 30s, especially when Hitler took power, little by little, your rights were taken away.
Absolutely, except I personally wouldn't call it little by little. If you look at the record, even in 1933 already, there were, all told, there were apparently hundreds of new laws passed during the length of the regime, anti-Jewish laws. But even in 1933, I mean, I have examples in my own family where almost within, I think, a month, I think it was in April of 1933, that the first ruling came out that any person who works, as in German it's called a Beamte, which means a public servant, and that included many people like doctors, professors at universities, lawyers, that kind of profession, which in Germany was very often state employees, so to speak, were fired overnight. And my uncle, and here's a specific example, who was the head of a very large, he was a doctor, by that time was the head of a very large hospital in a very large city in Germany called Hamburg in the north. And he was fired in 1933 for no other reason than because he was Jewish.
Eric, your family had lived in Germany for many generations and
Correct.
were integrated into German society, and nearly all Jews considered themselves first and foremost loyal Germans. You know, your father served at the front during World War I, and two of your mother's brothers were killed serving the German army in that war. In fact, 100,000 Jewish soldiers served in the German army in the Great War. Approximately 50,000 were killed in action. You said to me that they were Germans first, then they were Jewish. And I've never been able to understand how German Jews who were so loyal to their country became the enemy. What are your thoughts?
All I can say is that's what in fact happened. You know, it's like asking, I mean, the same sort of thing you could ask of all the African American soldiers that died in the Second World War in the United States. And you might say, why were they loyal to the United States with their history?
When you have so many, when you have 100,000 men serving in the army, fighting with you in the trenches against the French and the English and ultimately the Americans when they came in the war, all of a sudden they're turned on as the enemy when they were fighting for the German state, for the German nation. It just makes no sense.
Well, since it makes no sense, why do you think I have an explanation? But
Well,
the
I don't know.
important thing, though, isn't to keep restating all of these things because they're not that unique to the Hitler era, but to accept the fact that very ordinary citizens who have very many of the same, live by very many of the same sort of tenets of life, like we do, can, in fact, under the right circumstances, get involved. But one thing not to forget, though, is if you didn't get involved, there was a reasonable chance that you would end up getting killed. And unless you've been in that situation, it isn't really quite fair to be so judgmental of other people because we haven't, or many of us haven't been tested, that
Right.
a lot of people don't want to face up to.
That's an excellent point. I'm not sure that everyone is aware that Adolf Hitler, a lowly corporal in World War I, who rose to lead the Nazi Party, was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933 following a series of electoral victories by the Nazi Party. He then was elected, and let me repeat that, he was elected President of Germany, an unprecedented consolidation of power.
In a
What?
democratic country, the
Yes.
Weimar Republic was a democracy.
And Germany was considered one of the most civilized countries in Europe. How did they end up electing this demonic fascist?
If I had have known you were going to ask this, I should have gotten my degree in psychiatry. I mean, but I don't have anything that is uniquely succinct or anything like that.
I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that he was elected,
Yes.
that the people voted him into power despite the things that he said, and they agreed with him. They
Well,
followed him.
wait a minute. You're only saying what he said in terms of how he was going to deal with communism and anti-Semitism and all of that. He also promised that he would provide jobs, and he did that very effectively. And he also managed to start up what in Germany was one of the key industries, the chemical industry and the armaments industry, even though the Versailles Treaty strictly disallowed Germany having any kind of new armaments involvement. Hitler went ahead and did it. But most important, in answer to your question, he provided jobs, just like Roosevelt provided jobs after the Depression.
The New Deal.
Exactly. Now, you asked, why do people forget about the minuses and go for the pluses? And the answer is because they're human beings like you and me.
What was it like, Eric? And I can only imagine this. Stepping back, you went to elementary school with a few other Jewish boys, and apparently everyone had to attend a daily assembly in the schoolyard where the swastika flag was raised while everybody was singing Deutschland über alles, Germany above everything, which ended in today Germany is ours, tomorrow the whole world. However, the Jewish boys had to stand in the corner of the schoolyard facing a corner wall. It had to have been so humiliating.
Well, it was, of course, humiliating again at that point, I was in school for 2 years before I was kicked out and didn't go back to school until I was 13 when I was in England. But in any event, you asked, what did that feel like? Obviously, at that age, I think the reasonable answer is frightening. And again, why is this happening? That is the only answer I can give of how that felt.
It just feels like just being so ostracized, you're no longer part of the country, your city, your school, anything. Just you're persecuted for no reason at all.
Well, for no reason as far as you're concerned, but that's obviously not what a lot of other people who needed to have somebody to blame. And when you hear a government every day, and I mean not just the government, your teachers, your parents, in your church, you're told for one reason or another that all this bad life that they're having to live at that time is due to this one particular scapegoat, and that's what happened. If you hear it every single day, it's exactly the same thing that is happening with the polarization in this country today. And that, of course, if you listen to the same garbage day after day after day, and if you are not just reprimanded, but you're punished if you say anything in contrast to what the party party line is. So it's, again, your job is at stake.
Mm-hmm.
Your future is at stake. Then people don't behave the way they thought they would.
And there was no way of stopping Hitler. The courts were with him. Government was with him.
But you have to again say, if the courts were anybody in the court and in Hitler's regime, no matter how high up, if they weren't with him, they were out. They wouldn't be Jewish anyway. So even if they were the ultimate Aryan, if they opened their mouths in their official capacity, they'd be gone.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean just fired.
Well, they could be sent to concentration camps.
You're
They could be
damn
arrested.
right, and a lot of them did. There were quite a lot of dissenting clergy from the church. I had the number once, but it's of the order of something like 500,000 Gentiles that ended up being murdered by Hitler for all kinds of reasons.
There were other horrid incidents that terrorized the Jewish children. You had to listen to older boys and the Hitler Youth, which I think almost every young German Aryan person had to join. You saw these people marching and singing. If the Jews' blood spurts from the knife, then it's going to be even better. I mean, how do you cope with that?
I'll send you to my psychiatrist. But anyway, the point I want to make, I wasn't the only one that heard that often in the streets. I mean, as they were marching by, say, where we lived. But those kids' parents heard it too. And all the thousands of, especially in Heidelberg, which was a huge tourist trap, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
there were lots of people from all over the world who heard that, because it didn't just happen once in a while, it happened almost on a daily basis. So how come nobody ever took it seriously?
And wasn't Heidelberg one of the premier university cities in Germany?
Absolutely, but not only premier in terms of its academic standing, and by the way, is again today. This is, of course, however 70 or however many years later, but they're again have a very good reputation in all kinds of different areas.
Yeah, I've been there. It's a very beautiful city.
Let me add, Heidelberg was, and that was unfortunate for us, Heidelberg University had a number of very famous faculty at that time in the then emerging biosciences. And they were the ones who essentially tried to provide the technical backup information that a non-Aryan is not a human being. I mean, that sounds like a terrible statement, but scientists, if they feel that way inclined, are motivated to then spend the rest of their lives trying evidence for that. Now, I hope most people today listen to the evidence and know that that's, of course, an incredibly atrocious, outraged sort of conclusion to draw, namely that there are certain races that are subhuman.
The Untermenschen and the eugenics, that was a philosophy, an ideology, and that was developed in America.
That's also correct. Well, then I guess you are aware of what I think is the big problem, is how does one convince people that you and your neighbors could get caught up in something like that?
Not long after Hitler was democratically elected, Jews, as you mentioned, were declared Untermenschen, subhuman throughout Germany. But prior to 1933, of 81 Nobel Prizes that were awarded to Germans in science, literature, economics, medicine, 29 of them were won by German Jews. 36% even though Jews were less than 1% of the total population. One would think that Jews would be a source of pride, not a source of hatred.
Well, let me say, you're absolutely correct, but I'm not sure what I can add to that than the obvious insanity of that conclusion. But on the other hand, and of course that's continued to be the case in both in Germany and in many other countries, that obviously Jews as a nation have made some pretty fantastic contributions considering their numbers.
Years go by from 1933 when Hitler became chancellor and his rise to power. You had Kristallnacht, the
Yeah.
night of broken glass in 1938. Synagogues all over Germany were destroyed, cemeteries were desecrated, and Jewish stores were vandalized or demolished. Do you recall what happened in your household that night?
Absolutely. It was actually during the day. It started early in the morning when in this case, the SR, which are the brown shirts, about a dozen of these arrived. And by the way, the Kristallnacht changed the situation for Jews by an order of magnitude. I mean, after that, it was absolutely clear that there was no way in which you had a future in Germany. And it was very obvious that everything Hitler was telling you for years that he would do is about to happen, because this was in the end of 1938. And then, of course, less than a year later, the Second World War started, which is, of course, again, another thing. The little kids already in 33, and that's why I mentioned it to you, sang, Germany, Germany, above all, today, Germany, tomorrow, we own the whole world. Nobody was listening to that, at least not very many people. And so the Kristallnacht ended up with our entire furniture ending up on the streets. They broke them up with axes and threw them out the windows. And there were huge crowds of adults, and the school kids had a day off. And they were encouraged to throw stuff at all the windows of our house, and they were, of course, all broken. And that night, my dad was arrested, like every other Jewish male of the age of 16 or older. And they were taken to, in my dad's case, we didn't know for weeks as to what happened to him and all the other Jewish friends of his that were also arrested. But they ended up in Dachau, which was one of the, I guess, best known concentration camps near Munich. So, and it was soon after that I was able to escape from Germany, and my dad was in Dachau and my mother was back. By this time, we lived in a house, they called them Judenhaus, Jew house, which was sort of like a ghetto. I mean, it was only Jews lived there, and we had to move out from where we lived before to move into one of these houses.
Well, you mentioned Dachau. They had already built this camp. They were ready.
Well, not only had they built it, yes, they were ready, because they had this excuse that a German diplomat was in fact killed by a young Jewish man whose parents had just been subjected to some horrible things, and he, lost his cool or however you want to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
And the very next day, all the Jews in Germany the male Jews over 16 years were arrested and taken to a different camp, and Dachau was one of them. They were ready. They had all the striped uniforms, Star of David. I mean, they were totally ready for all of this. So they were just clearly waiting for an opportunity, and that's sort of how the whole extermination business started.
Your father, he received a tattoo on on his arm.
Yes.
A number. He no longer was a human. He was a number.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned a few months after Kristallnacht in 1939, just a couple of months before World War II broke out in Poland, you were finally able to leave Germany by yourself at the age of 12 and a half on a kinder transport to England, the children's transport, leaving your mother and your father and your uncles and your aunts and cousins, your family. You had to leave them behind in Germany, and you had to live with strangers in England. That had to be the most awful experience. At least you were being freed from the Nazi terror.
Absolutely. But again, as a child, you don't go through all of this analysis like we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it was just frightening. And there were lots and lots of new things. And you have to remember that not only did I join a totally strange family who, who saved my life by essentially making it possible to come to their place. I not only wasn't English, I didn't speak a word of English, and they didn't speak a word of German. So communicating was a real issue for quite a while. But fortunately, as a kid, apparently, I was good and motivated. That's the big word. I was motivated to learn English as fast as possible, because guess what? When I finally was admitted to an English school, there were lots of course, other little boys just my age, and you'd be surprised how cruel kids could be. These were now all English kids and had nothing to do with the fact that I was Jewish. But now all of a sudden, I was the little Kraut kid. I was the little enemy alien kid.
Mm-hmm.
So those were all kind of eye-opening experiences. This happened in England.
I realize that, and I just can't comprehend the psychological damage that had to go on for all of the kids who left Germany and had to experience what you went through. After the war, you learned that 15 members of your extended family, uncles, aunts, cousins who lived in the Heidelberg area, had been forcibly taken from their homes in 1940, and they were sent to Vichy, France, which was a Nazi-controlled part of France. And from there, they were shipped in cattle cars to Auschwitz and never heard from again. What happened to your mother and father and your brother?
That's a very happy story now, because my brother was able to leave on a kinder transport about 2 months before I was able to go. But anyway, so my brother got out, and my brother was also, he and I were only able to come out under two conditions. A, that we had a guarantor in England who would take us in, and he had a family that took him in, and I had a family that took me in. And then we also had to show that we were planning eventually to leave England. This is now just before the war started, to leave England, and that we had application to go to America. But for all kinds of convoluted reasons, my brother was able to get out of Germany a couple of months earlier than I did. And so he was able to, whatever the right word is, cash in on the fact that he could apply to come to America, and he was allowed to come to America, which wasn't easy, believe me. I mean, England was the country that opened its gates to 10,000 kids, Jewish kids, to come in 1938 until the war starts. I want to add, just to put things in perspective, the United States wouldn't let us in. And
I know.
And my brother got out because he had this thing to come to America, which my parents, or my mother actually, had worked out you actually registered to come to another country, in this case America, already way back in 1935.
Right.
And here it was 1939 now, or even 1940.
How did your parents get out? How did they escape?
My dad did get out of Dachau under the condition that he and my mother, and this was before the war, one day before the war started, namely the 29th of August,
39.
1939, one day before, my dad apparently got out a day before he got out of Dachau, and he said to my mother, "We are leaving tomorrow." And they left everything that they still had, and they left with 10 marks, which is like $3 at that time, in their pocket, and one suitcase. And they left Germany and they got into Holland. So my parents actually did get out, which of course is a real
It's a
blessing.
miracle. It's a
Yeah,
miracle your
yeah.
immediate family survived. Now you eventually emigrated to the United States. You attended UC Berkeley, earning a PhD in physics, and conducted breakthrough research on photosynthesis. You also worked at the IBM Research Center, pioneering research in nano and surface science. You were a member of the faculty at Stanford University in the material science and applied physics department. How did you find the strength to transition from Nazi Germany, living with strangers, being called Kraut Boy in England, and then coming to America and achieving such success?
But it isn't especially unique. I mean, sort of transfer that to the millions of immigrants that have come to the United States with similar, sad stories to tell, arriving with absolutely nothing, no education and no assets of any kind. And guess what? They can become the president of the United States. And
Well,
some claim that they went through exactly the same kind of routine.
yeah.
But it isn't unique. I mean, it's what human beings can do, and there are lots of us who do it. That anybody that is listening or that you talk to about this, that they can say, "Hey, I have all kinds of relatives that have that kind of history, or my granddad." So that's what
Right.
human beings do.
Well, you couldn't become the president of the United States without being born here in America, but you could rise to very,
But anyway, I just mentioned the President of the United States.
yeah.
You don't have to be born in America to get on the faculty at Stanford.
Eric, let's turn, since you're in America. Let's talk about America. We've seen what some would consider a pathway to fascism in America. We saw the violent racist demonstration in Charlottesville, Virginia, where neo-Nazis were screaming about Jews will not replace us, and you had President Trump saying, well, there were very fine people on both sides. I don't know how he came to that kind of conclusion that Nazis were very fine people, but what were your thoughts when you saw that on television?
I don't want to draw the analogy because it isn't accurate at all, but that's how somebody like Hitler started. Took advantage of a lot of being unhappy. The same thing is true in the US. There are a lot of people who are unhappy about all kinds of things that have nothing whatsoever to do with whether you're Jewish or whatever. We find scapegoats all over the place who we blame for all the ills that are making people's lives difficult. But lives in the US, at this point, are nothing like the lives were, when you ended up in a gas chamber. The thing that's so scary, and the thing that people don't realize, that it all happened in less than 10 years when you get a fanatic, like Hitler in charge, who, as a fascist, of course, means there's He has the power to implement anything, and he gets away, or she, by the way, gets away with saying, and anybody who stands in my way, I will destroy, I'll kill, I'll get rid of. Now,
Right.
you might say, how could anybody go along with that? Well, I have lots and lots of German people that I know because I went back to Germany actually for 3 years in the late 80s and early 90s. But now I dealt with exclusively with people who were maybe by then in their 40s at most, but they weren't even alive during Hitler's era. So the point is, they not only had this incredible guilt trip of what their parents' generation were responsible for to live with. I got to know them, and I got to know how to interact with them. And as you, I think, would have to agree, that Germany today, and you can figure out how many years ago, I mean, how long they've been around now, since the end of World War II. I mean, it's quite a while.
78 years.
Okay, you did it. Very good. Anyway, today, I know in general, and certainly my personal contacts, and I have many in Germany, who are very commendable in everything they do and say. And I mean do and say. And that's, to me, is the hopeful sign that even though here was this incredibly advanced culture, the German culture in before Hitler was, sort of in Europe at least, considered as one of the most advanced in all kinds of areas of human endeavor. And they sank to as low as we did. But here we are, and they have recovered. Doesn't mean they don't have problems. They have anti-Semites in Germany, of course.
Yes. Let's get back to the Trump administration for a moment, because we witnessed severe anti-Semitism occurring again in America since he took power in 2016. Terrible things were said and done to Jewish people, to immigrants fleeing the drug cartels and violence in Latin America trying to come to this country. What did you think when you saw these events occurring on TV and heard about the massacre at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh? Did this have parallels for you to what was going on in Germany?
Of course, it had, I would say it left the same fear, if you will, as I experienced when I was a little kid at the beginning of all of this. But the fact that these things happen worldwide isn't unique to the US. I mean, you can ask yourself, why would the US be any different? Why do we think we're so different to the rest of the world? I mean, I know I could give, I could speculate about our incredible, worthwhile system of government and all of that, but that doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. I mean, the fact that potentially there are people who are unhappy, who need to find somebody to blame for their unhappiness, that's a universal human condition.
And then you find a leader who is charismatic and develops a cult around himself.
And that a leader like Hitler, I don't want to talk about Trump, because I don't think he is.
Yeah.
But in any event, but a guy like Hitler in a democratic country, in fact, can, in a short period of time, take over and essentially make all of these horror things happen.
As I mentioned at the beginning, the Supreme Court has reversed Roe versus Wade that denies a woman's right to choose whether she bears a child. Affirmative action has been reversed. Students are being forced to pay off these huge debt levels. The LGBTQ community has come under attack over free speech issues. We've seen book bannings and the anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant attacks. Are we losing our rights slowly, piece by piece, shred by shred?
Well, what other conclusion can you come to than say yes? But once again, that's been said now so often. I think as people, we ought to be talking about, since it's sort of at the beginning, what can we as individuals do to stop that? And obviously, I have no illusions that I can solve any of these problems. But as an individual, I can say, what can I do on a daily basis to at least play my little part? And there are lots of things you can do, but the most basic thing is to have some criteria of how you judge what you will tolerate and what you won't. And I've come at this stage, being 97 or almost 97, with a simple number one criteria, and I don't care what the topic under discussion may be, and that is, do I think what's being proposed is ethical? Moral is the other word I was looking for. Does it have a moral and ethical basis that I can go along with? And then if it doesn't meet that litmus test, I'm against it, because most of the other aspects, unless they happen to be dependent on the physics of the problem, which sometimes is in fact the case, but most problems, are about economics and sociology, and I'm not an expert in these things. My criterion is, and that's good enough for me, I don't think this is a moral or ethical or meets my standards of that, I'm against it.
Eric, let me ask you, looking out at America today, you've been here a very long time. Should Americans be concerned about freedom, about democracy, about losing freedom and democracy? I know this is not Nazi Germany.
How can the answer be anything but, of course, I'm concerned? I mean, that's what I think we've been talking about.
I know, but are there echoes of fascism?
Absolutely.
And so you say we should do our part. Every single person should do their whatever they can do.
Yeah, but we need to make sure that we talk to people. Like I felt, what can I as an individual do? And one example I'd like to give, just to give an example, I asked myself, well, what special kind of insight do I have? And one of them was an area of science. And the other was that I speak fluent German, and another was that I did, in fact, know how to get an opportunity to spend 3 years in Germany, not just a week on the beautiful River Rhine, but living in Germany, as I said, in the 80s and 90s. And one of the conditions for my going to Germany was, in fact, that I would have the opportunity in my job or related to my job to talk to young German students, faculty, while I was there as part of my obligation, and then try and talk with them about what the issues were. And obviously, being Jewish, that at times was not easy, but nevertheless, I found it very rewarding. And I came away with feeling that I've accomplished quite a bit for one individual. Now that isn't going to change the world for sure, but that's the kind of thing that I think each of us ought to be doing. What can I do that gives me a special in? And of course, one other thing I learned, which is worth, I think, telling at this point, is I did not spend all my time trying to remind these young people in Germany, and that started in high school, and I talked to students in universities. So in that age group, that you don't start with reciting to them what we've done here now of all the horrors in their country. Young people in Germany, the ones who are going to be in leading roles, I mean, kids who can read and write, if you will, and there on up, they have all heard about the Holocaust. And of course, there are some who haven't, just like there's some Jewish kids that allegedly haven't heard of it in the United States, which I find kind of incredible, but apparently that's true. So anyway, there are some who haven't, but the vast majority have been inundated with the Holocaust, and they know about that. But if you want them to change, you can't start out by saying you're all a bunch of murderers and whatever else you want to call them. You want to find out what are their issues that they are facing today in their lives. And the Jewish problem, although it certainly exists again in Germany, isn't the main thing that the German young people have to deal with. They have to deal, like we do, with a whole inevitable problems that are inherent in all of this migration of people from other countries who come to Germany now. And by the way, Germany, if you remember, in 2015, admitted 1.5 million immigrants.
Syrians.
Well, Syrians and many other nationalities, but 1.5 million, and it's the population of Germany, I think, is about 80 million at most. And so and of course, most of these immigrants were not Christian. Most of these immigrants were not white. Most of these immigrants had totally different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. And yes, of course, that's causing problems like it would be anywhere else.
Sure.
But it can be done. Now, that's what I and the young people in Germany, that's what we were talking about. Keep going back to the Jewish question only. You have an opportunity to demonstrate that you not only know about the Holocaust, but you've learned from that, and now you have the same problems to deal with, namely people that somebody's telling you are different than you are, and yet you will have to live with them, and it's a very positive thing. The United States is the best proof of that.
Eric, you mentioned that these young people had nothing to do with the extermination of the Jews. They weren't alive. But it is important for them to learn about what happened.
I didn't say they shouldn't, but I'm telling you, of course, there's a fraction that won't know, but the vast majority does.
Well, I know they're teaching the subject of the Holocaust and the Nazi
era. Right.
It's mandatory in German schools.
That's exactly right.
And in addition to that, the classroom curriculum, almost all students have either visited a concentration camp or a Holocaust memorial or museum. I mean, that seems to be extremely important. And we in America are not doing the same thing. We're trying to cancel culture. We're trying to eliminate learning about slavery, about what we did to the indigenous people, about the fact that we didn't allow Jews to come here when they were desperate on the St. Louis. We turned a ship back to Germany, and those people ended up in Auschwitz.
No, I know that, and you're absolutely correct. And that's why I say, as an individual, anytime somebody, as an individual in your daily life, comes up with sort of talking about these atrocities like you've just mentioned, and the kind of thing that we have analogy to in the United, every time you see that in your own life, do something about it. Stop that person and essentially, bring it out so that people will change on a one-on-one basis. That may not solve the whole problem, but that's all I feel I can do at this point in my life.
Well, the Germans have built monuments about the Holocaust.
Damn right.
They've banned Nazi symbols. They don't allow the
And
Nazi.
we're just now beginning to take symbols down. And there are a lot of people here who say that's atrocious. Well, those are the ones that I want to talk to.
Supporting the Confederacy and supporting slavery. Those are the statues
Yeah.
that have been
Yeah,
taken.
but do it in your daily lives. Don't just intellectualize about it.
But yet in Germany today, you have this new political party, the Alternative for Germany. It's called the AfD.
Yes.
Many consider it to be a neo-Nazi party. How dangerous is that they are now part of the political process?
I
Okay.
mean, of course it's bad, but how dangerous it is today really means if I were a political scientist and knew all the ins and outs of what is causing it, which I don't, but obviously I keep coming back. To me, the most important thing for people is to say, what can I hope to do about it? To do that, you have to sort of ask yourself, what do I have to offer? And it may be just a little, but it may be more than you think, and then do something with it.
But even if you talk to your neighbor who believes something totally different than you do, it becomes confrontational.
Yes, and nobody likes that.
But so how do you deal with that when you were? I've had friends during this whole Trump era that I can't talk to anymore because of the things that they've said and the things that they believe and the things that they support. How do you change that dynamic?
By listening to the other person.
I have. It's like it would be like the same thing
Yeah.
as saying to someone who supported Hitler, hey, you shouldn't support this guy. Look what he's saying. Look what he's doing. He's murdering people. But the German people said, well, he's got a rationale and there's a reason for it. He's spelled it out in Mein Kampf, My Struggle. What's wrong with Hitler? He's building the Autobahns and he's putting people.
Yeah, but there you have to remind them, how often do you go to church and say, we're all created equal under the eyes of God? I mean, if people who say that are also the ones who are constantly telling you, as I just inferred, how ethical they are and so on. You say, then you can sort of challenge them and say, and how do you deal with that? Going on Sunday saying one thing and then on Monday doing something totally different.
Right.
And some people you won't be able to convince. I mean, obviously, once again, imagine how many sessions millions of people go and see their psychiatrist and still don't get their problems solved. So what makes you think that you can do it?
No, I know, and I'm not a psychiatrist, and neither are you. And I really appreciate you taking your time to talk with us about this. We could go on and on. Maybe we're doing our small part just by having this conversation and putting it out there for other people to listen to. Hopefully, we'll revisit this critical issue in the future. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Eric, I want to just thank you again for taking the time with me today.
Okay, you're very welcome.
And that was Eric Kay, a Holocaust survivor and esteemed member of the scientific community in the Silicon Valley of California, and a man who believes, despite all the horrors he's seen in his lifetime, that we can still overcome and that good can conquer over evil. I'm Jim Paymar, and you've been listening to The Big Shift, available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening today, and stay tuned for the next episode of The Big Shift. It's coming soon.